Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to FTA's Brexit webinar for August 2017. My name is James Hookham. I'm FTA's Deputy Chief Executive, and I shall be hosting this afternoon's presentation, introducing my colleagues who are going to provide the presentations and make sure that your questions are answered, which hopefully you'll be able to provide us through the webinar platform. We've got a huge amount to talk about, as I'm sure I needn't point out to you. Brexit remains at the top of the news agenda, and there have been some very significant developments in just the past few days about the importance of supply chain and logistics in the Brexit debate. We are going to cover as many of those as we can in the next hour or so. I shall give a brief overview of political developments that have taken place over the past few weeks, but we will be specifically focusing on four particular topics, looking at the developments in the UK and the introduction of the Great Repeal Bill into Parliament, the emergence this week of significant new proposals for future customs arrangements between the UK and the EU, some important statements made about the scope for new trade deals outside the EU by the government, and the equally pressing and urgent issue of the access of UK employers to EU workers after Brexit. And to help me do that, I have my colleagues on hand. Christopher Snelling, who's the head of UK and regional policy, will be talking about the repeal bill as it makes its way through Parliament. Alex Leach, head of global policy, will discuss the new customs proposals that were published this week and how they will affect future trade with the EU. Chris Welsh, our Director of Global and European Policy, will examine the implications of various statements made regarding global trade. And Sally Gilson, our Head of Skills Campaigning, will analyse some of the statements and developments regarding EU workers and their status in the UK. We have a healthy number of delegates online, I'm pleased to say, so welcome to you if you're joining an FTA Brexit webinar for the first time. Just a quick reminder on the house rules, if I may. Please keep your microphones and telephones muted. We are recording the webinar. It will be available for download from the FTA website at a later date. I'm afraid that we won't be able to deal with any of your technical questions regarding the actual webinar setup, but we do have a chat box facility on the webinar platform which will allow you to submit your questions. Please do so at any point in the proceedings if you want any particular point clarified or you have a question that you feel we're not covering. So please do make this as interactive and as satisfying for yourselves as possible. And if we can't answer all of your questions in the time available today, we will get back to you with an answer in the next few days or so. So, as I said, there has been plenty to talk about over the past few weeks, and barely a day goes by without the political developments occupying the front pages of the newspapers and most of the top stories on the broadcast media. From a supply chain and logistics point of view, I think there are four particular developments that we would point to as perhaps encouraging, or at least offering some indication of the government's thinking. It wasn't long after the general election itself that the Chancellor Philip Hammond started to talk about the need for transitional trading arrangements. As far as FTA is concerned, this was welcome recognition at the very top level of government that it probably couldn't all happen within the next 19 months, and there was going to need to be some additional time for the new trading arrangements to be agreed and the necessary infrastructure and declaration systems to be developed and implemented in order for exporters and importers to cope with those. This culminated as recently as last Sunday when a well-publicised statement by Philip Hammond and Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, seemed to signify that there was indeed a consensus in the Cabinet for the need for some kind of transitional or interim arrangements. Liam Fox himself has also been talking to the media and gave a statement a few weeks ago signifying the fact that he's considering alternatives to free trade agreements as ways of striking new trade deals with non-EU countries, and offering some indication of the new options that might become available to exporters and importers once Britain leaves the European Union. On the EU workers' side, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd also pointed to the need for a transitional period to allow employers to continue to access EU workers after Brexit. And we'll be hearing about the survey that she has commissioned on the use of migrant workers now, and how that might help to support the case that certainly in the logistics sector there will need to be continued use of such workers after Brexit if, for example, our driver shortage is to be mitigated and addressed. Now, at the time, it was significant that despite all of these statements being made by various members of the Cabinet, the official line from number 10 remained there are no changes in Brexit policy, and the Lancaster House statement and the white paper that shortly followed it were still the statements that applied. So there was still some evidence of disagreement amongst the government, but I think as we'll hear as we go through the webinar, some of the statements that have been made since suggest that there is movement towards a consensus around certain points, and we can certainly take some encouragement from that and continue to promote some of these opportunities in our conversations with government. Perhaps the most important thing, though, is that supply chain continuity and logistics now does seem to be top of the government's agenda, and that's got to be a good result for members of the Freight Transport Association. So against that overall political backdrop, let's have a look at some of the developments in some greater detail. And our first subject is going to be the UK developments. And I'm joined by Christopher Snelling, who's the FTA's Head of UK and Regional Policy, to talk about the Great Repeal Bill. So Christopher, the Great Repeal Bill, what does it aim to do exactly?
Thank you, James. Yes, this has been a much talked about bill, and its title has given rise to a lot of misunderstanding. The title of it, as it was first announced, was really just a good piece of marketing, and it sounded exciting and attractive to many people. It is now in Parliament, though, under the rather more accurate title of the EU Brackets Withdrawal Bill. So, what this bill does is it transposes EU law and systems into the UK. If we didn't have this bill, we didn't act in this way, then on the day of Brexit, an awful swathe of the regulation and laws that have an origin in EU rules would simply become would be unenforceable and have no legal status in the UK. So therefore, the idea with this is that it sets up, it takes us out of the EU, but it moves that existing body of law into it and sets up the systems we need in order to function. But as we say, it's not actually intended to alter the substance or the content of the regulations. So it's that's the key sense in which it is not a repeal of regulation, it's a repeal of legal instruments and a replacement with another set.
Okay, so is it just a single bill, or are there more to come?
There is actually more. This is a kind of parent document in which there's going to be 7 further bills which have already been announced to go with this. 3 of those are of particular interest to us. You can see those outlined there. Of these, obviously, we will get into an incredible amount of detail in each of these areas, especially perhaps customs with the enormous degree of technical complexity in those areas. But also for the trade bill, we need a mechanism. We literally have no mechanism at the moment legally to strike a trade deal with anyone else, and the same with setting our own immigration rules with EU countries. So if we take trade as an example, as I say, it's not this bill isn't a trade deal with another country, nor will it determine what our trading relationship with the EU is, but it creates the actual mechanism that the government can then use to sign a trade deal. So there may be elements in this that are quite important.
So this is all about sovereignty coming home and actually being restored to the UK Parliament.
Yes, it is. It gives Parliament and government the capability to do all these things.
Okay, but I know in our discussions with various backbench MPs, we've heard the suggestion that once this bill reached Parliament, they would have a go at trying to repeal their least favourite EU directive. Is that a possibility still? Could we see some real guerrilla warfare on the backbenches come the autumn?
Absolutely, yes, because the government hasn't done themselves any favour with the marketing label they gave it before. It got a lot of people, including in Parliament, very excited that this was the final chance to leap free in a single bound of all that nasty EU regulation that's been holding them back. The government doesn't have a majority. These bills have to go through committees on which they won't have majorities, but also they have a very large swathe of their own backbenchers who will want to put forward particular changes that their hobby horses and issues of interest where they'll want to get particular measures repealed. The government is going to fight that very, very strongly. They're going to hold to a core line that this is not content, it is process. What the government have told us is that what they really want from all of this is that they want to exactly mirror what the EU is doing at the moment, what the EU has, because that puts them in the better negotiating position for the transitionary deal we're now talking about. The closer we are to EU regulations, the easier it is to agree a deal. And the line the government will put forward is all of the actual repeal of the regulation that we could do, we will do after day one of Brexit, once we know where we stand with the EU.
So now is not the time to start trying to make a case for repealing our particular directives or legislation.
It's still something that FJ is going to be quite active on in Parliament, talking with the MPs who are interested in this, because what we can do is we can work to try and put down markers for the future.
Yes.
It's can we identify and pick up the things we would actually like change when the time is right. Let's get a marker down now that that's out there, and then we're on a more fertile ground when it comes to future discussion with ministers about what we can do.
Good. Okay, so plenty going on in the UK Parliament over the course of the autumn. Thank you very much, Christopher. Back on UK-EU trade, it's been a big week for understanding the government's thinking about the way that what trade will happen with the rest of the European Union in the future. And here to talk about that is Alex Veitch, our Head of Global Policy and Customs Expert. Alex, so what did the government actually publish and propose in the document that emerged on Tuesday?
Thanks, James. Well, it published one of its series of papers that are coming out regularly now. This one's about customs. It kind of sets out the strategic objectives that the British government wants to see, and then the quite firm proposals on how they would like to establish customs and with that trading relationships with the EU, which of course has implications for non-EU trade as well. It's basically
so this is.
And EU.
I think we're losing you, Alex. I think we've got some technical problems here. You're still there, Alex? Hello, Alex. You're still there?
Yes, I'm here, James. I'm here, James. Sorry, I thought you were asking me something there.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, Alex, listen. So, what does the proposal actually consist of? What were the contents of the document, and what did the government actually propose?
Okay, so it's talking about starting off with an interim period, which would be in some way similar to the customs union we have now, although they're very careful to say that it would be an association with the customs union as opposed to remaining a member of it. So there may be some tricky details in there to understand. But after an interim period, we then are speaking about two broad options, which they refer to here as a streamlined arrangement and then a new customs partnership.
Right. So let's have a look at each of those in turn. Alex, what are the types of relationship that are on offer here? How would the streamlined arrangements work first? Take us through that. Okay,
so this is where we draw a customs border around Britain, and then we are in a world where we're trying to simplify and reduce the friction at that border as far as possible. And there are quite a lot of ideas in that paper which could be very helpful to reduce the friction, make it easier for traders to move goods around.
So take us through those. There's quite
yeah, sorry, yeah, picking up some of the key ones. I think, to me, the two most interesting ones here are trying to get a waiver for the requirement to make a security declaration. So any goods that are traded, brought into the European Union from outside the EU, as well as all the customs and transport information, you have to send a separate electronic message to the security authorities. So if we could achieve some kind of waiver for that, that would at a stroke remove what could be quite an additional burden for traders. And the second most important one, really, to my mind, is the membership of the Common Transit Convention. This is where this is used by neighbouring countries to the EU to allow fast transit of goods across the EU from or to non-EU countries. The other issues are more technical, and they're around how to sort of use trusted trader type of arrangements to allow faster access to traders with a strong record of compliance on customs and security regulation.
Okay, so these are obviously proposals that the government has made as part of its continuing negotiation with the EU, and all of this is subject to agreement with them, and that will emerge when the negotiations get underway again, which I believe is the week after next. But what can the UK do on its own? Is there anything we can be getting on with in the meantime?
Well, this is where there's some really interesting stuff in there, and these are things that we've been talking about with our members and putting forward as well. Yes, there are. You know, we can make, the government can choose to make the UK a trade-friendly country, you know, within and without the EU. So we're talking here about better simplifications, making it easier for businesses to access all the good stuff you can get through the customs system at the moment that perhaps don't know about. Ensuring that people can send parcels and the Royal Mail can move goods, you know, hopefully as easily as they do now. And also, what I was really pleased to see was a commitment to work with business to gather in other ideas, and we hope that that's going to be followed up going forward.
Yes, indeed, and I think this is a great opportunity for all members that are involved in UK-EU trade, whether as exporters or importers, or indeed as logistics providers. To surface with us what the simplifications are that they would like to see. It's really good to see the language being used that we've been talking about in British Shippers Council and other meetings for many months. So trusted trader and pre-clearance and post-payment and possible discussion about consignment level thresholds and so on. All of this appears to be in the mix now. So the idea of actually attending to some of the detail around trade facilitation, it's very pleasing to see expressed in these terms. We do need to be cautious again though, and I stress this is just a proposal from, the first proposals from the UK side. It may not end up looking like this once it's been through, I'm sure will be a tough negotiation, but it's encouraging that the government has not only decided to take this step and start to discuss these issues in this detail, but it's also put them right at the top of the agenda and not left the trade issues until much later in the process, as we first feared that it might. So I guess we're pretty pleased about this, Alex. How close does this get, do you think, to what members are actually telling us they want to achieve? Is there more to be done?
Well, yeah, there's more to be done. I mean, look, the key thing for us is the transition. You know, the streamlined arrangements and the other scheme that's been put forward, talking about a new partnership. I mean, both these things will take time to sort out.
Okay.
And the transition is absolutely key to that. And I think it's fair to say we are delighted to see a very, very firm commitment to some kind of interim arrangement to be put in place, James.
Okay, well, we should just briefly deal with the second option that the government presented as well. So they did this idea of a simplified relationship with the EU in the ways that we described, but there was also this rather step-out proposal about an entirely new customs partnership. What does that consist of, Alex? What's the offer there?
Well, yes, this is a really interesting idea. I must confess, I hadn't seen this before, and I think it was quite new to a lot of the other business interests in this field. But here is where I had in a previous slide, you had a customs border drawn around Britain. In this example, you don't have that border. You don't have a customs border between Britain and the EU. Instead, you draw the customs border really where it is now, around Britain and the EU. So this is really interesting stuff and would be a fabulous prize if we can win it. But really, the devil's a little bit in the detail. You know, the paper goes into this in more detail, but it's saying that there would have to be some way to check whether goods are bound for the UK or bound for the EU, and if the latter, some form of way to track these goods and make sure that whoever receives them in the European Union pays the right level of duty, and that the goods comply. So, you know, a lot of homework to do, but a fascinating idea, and look forward to sort of delving into this as we go forward.
Yes, of course, because this would really make up for much greater simplification if we could achieve it. It struck me as it was almost the UK positioning itself as the gatekeeper for the European Union. So, as you say, even if goods came into the UK that were destined for the EU, the wider EU eventually, the UK would sort out which tariff applies and which conformity requirements apply. So that would keep things pretty much the way they are for traders and exporters. But we do need to see the detail on that. So that was quite a fascinating development there. Alex, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll hear more about that as those proposals are negotiated and developed. And we'll certainly be sharing those ideas and our further interpretation of them with our own customs working group and the British Shippers Council at its meetings during the autumn. So if you want to know more and want to join in, please do let us know, because those will be the meetings and forums in which we take these ideas forward. So we dealt with UK developments, we've just dealt with UK-EU trade developments. One of the big selling points of Brexit, though, would be the opportunity for the UK to strike new trade deals outside the European Union and free of the current restrictions that the European offers. And here to discuss the various developments and announcements that have been made about that over the summer is Chris Welsh, Director of Global and European Policy. And from where you sort of stand, Chris, looking over this, looking over your role as Secretary General of the Global Shippers Forum as well, how do you see the scope for Britain to strike its own trade deals now with other countries?
Yeah, the government has devoted quite a bit of thought to this in the customs paper that you've previously been discussing under the heading of establishing an independent international or global trade policy for the UK. And it's clearly one of the key objectives that the government has, and one of the reasons for its whole position on Brexit has been to try to get a better focus on international trade as opposed to just intra-community trade. We know that the scope for the UK to currently strike trade deals with the EU is very limited. In other words, the UK can't agree any trade deals until we've actually reached an agreement under the 2-year arrangements with the EU, although we may have some flexibility with the provisional transitional arrangements if they're accepted. So it very much depends on the shape of our international trade deals. Will very much depend on our future relationship with the EU and the outcome of those negotiations. And the customs paper does provide some really quite interesting, innovative ideas about how it can both solve the UK's problem in getting better trade deals, but also to assist the European Union. I'm not quite sure if the European Union may see it in that light, but certainly it provides some interesting ideas. But in order to do that, the first key thing that the UK has got to do is it's got to have a new relationship with the WTO. So at the moment, UK's interests are dealt with as the EU as a bloc within WTO, so it needs to rejoin the WTO. And in the paper, the UK makes a strong commitment not only to join it, but to engage with the WTO, accepting the rules-based system, and makes it very clear. In fact, the UK was one of the very founding members of the WTO and the customs trade facilitation issues that are part and parcel of that. So any future trade deals will clearly be subject to WTO rules. But as you say, James, with regard to what our members want and what sort of international traders want, and more importantly, some of our colleagues in the Global Shippers Forum are looking for, is they're looking for something better than WTO and looking at some of the advantages for further trade simplifications. And again, I think the paper makes some interesting proposals in that in that regard. So we're clearly going to be looking at something below WTO tariff levels and duty rates, one that would encourage trade. And certainly a very, very big FTA and, in fact, Global Shippers Forum proposal in discussions with a number of our members, particularly developing countries such as Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, were that we retain the system of generalised preferences. And this is quite key to UK importers that do a considerable amount of business with these economies. And the sudden withdrawal of the kind of facilities that might be available under the EU would place that business under competitive pressure. So the one very big result that we have had with government over the last few months has been their acceptance that they will, an agreement that they will continue the system of generalised preference. So that's a really good outcome for the members.
Absolutely, and particularly for those in the garment and apparel sector, with the countries you mentioned, very big suppliers of products there. Okay, so that's a good FTA win. What else is on FTA's global trade agenda, Chris? Where are we going to be promoting members' interests over the next few months?
Well, it is very much in the area of developing what we're calling shipper-friendly trade features. And certainly looking at mutual recognition for trusted trader schemes, and that's something we developed quite early with a number of our partners in GSF that are looking at this Brexit thing as interestedly as we are. Yeah. And again, confirmation in the government paper that they will be looking similarly to within new free trade agreements, have mutual recognition for trusted trade schemes will be a key win in terms of enabling trade simplifications, faster border control arrangements and security arrangements, and so on. So that's quite a big win. And in fact, that's quite interesting in the sense that the government paper points out that as much as 60% of our AEO imports are under AEO scheme, and 74% of exports. So that's a very important win for for the UK. So third country, some of the really quite interesting things in the paper is the potential for third country access to both the UK and EU market, as Alex referred to earlier. The fact that the UK will effectively apply the EU external border for all goods coming into the UK for ultimate delivery into continental Europe or the EU will be a very big benefit for our members, GSF members, and other countries, because it provides a solution to a problem that they were looking at in terms of how they would differentiate there. Okay. And so I think the other interesting thing in the policy paper is the commitment to explore further trade and customs simplifications and in cooperation agreements to reduce delays and revenue risks and so on. So it looks like everything could be on the table for us in terms of the sort of non-tariff trade barriers we want stripped away, looking afresh at what customs facilitation issues we could bring into place. It picks up on something that would apply to both EU and both our external trade, the whole area of looking at things like self-assessment, and extension of existing framework for duty suspensions and reliefs. Those kind of things are really quite big wins for the FTA, because those are the sort of things that we were arguing for.
Okay. Well, it's a bit of a left field question, but it all comes back to the same thing, Chris. So Michael O'Leary, the boss of Ryanair, was on the television last week warning that his and other airlines may not be able to take bookings for flights in the summer of 2019 when they publish their schedules this time next year, because of the uncertainty over the UK reaching a new aviation deal with the EU. Now, okay, there are concerns for passengers there, but clearly a lot of freight moves by air, and FTA and the GSF have certainly been championing the importance of that in the economy. From all your years working in the aviation sector, could this happen? And if it did, what do you think the impact would be on movement of air freight around Europe?
Well, the short answer to that is yes, it could. Clearly we do need a separate aviation agreement. Scheduled UK operating airlines can trade within Europe. Air freight moves by truck mainly within Europe. A lot of the EU kind of simplifications that we've been calling for will be absolutely critical to the air freight sector in getting it right, a bit like the express business and parcels business that Alex referred to earlier. But if we don't get agreement on this, the UK, Heathrow is one of the major international air freight hubs with a lot of freight coming into the UK for onward shipment under a flight number to other destinations in Europe. And that could become hugely complex unless we actually have an EU agreement that covers this kind of arrangement for air freight. Yeah, so
okay.
It's pure and simple.
So we're right to be worried?
We're right to be worried.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. Well, we'll obviously keep that under review as well. I suspect Mr. O'Leary is going to be able to be making the point at least as well as we do. So that's something we'll keep a close eye on. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Chris. A common worry right across the transport and logistics sector, though, is continued access to EU workers after Brexit. And again, there's been some important developments in this area over the past few weeks. And here to discuss those and present on those is Sally Gilson, FTA's Head of Skills Campaigning. And so we've been doing some research, Sally, on just how big an issue employment of migrant workers in the UK sector actually is. Just take us through some of those numbers.
Yeah, thanks, James. So from the latest data that the FTA skills shortage report has compiled, driver shortage currently stands at 35,000. So losing EU drivers could actually have quite a serious effect. To put some numbers behind this, 13% of HGV drivers, that equates to 43,000. 9% of professional van drivers, that's 22,000. 18% of forklift truck drivers, that's another 16,000 workers. And then a massive 26% of warehouse workers, that's 113,000 people. So that's a lot of people that we've got to find when the unemployment rate is at a record low.
Right, well, you jumped over it, but I'm going to take you back to your previous slide there, because I saw that in the middle there we provided a bit of a benchmark. So these are all massive numbers. Certainly we find it useful when we're trying to convey the size of this to politicians and so on, just to put some kind of benchmark in. So the capacity of the Rico Stadium,
yes,
32,000. So we effectively need as many drivers
that would fill a stadium.
that would fill a football stadium.
Yeah,
so
and that would be on top of the 35,000 that we already need.
Yeah, okay. So that just puts it into some kind of perspective, and we're not particularly showing any great affiliation with Coventry City.
No, I live in Wales, so I
so as a useful benchmark in just trying to explain the scale of the driver shortage, and indeed the scale of reliance on EU drivers, using the football stadium analogy just might be a way of conveying that, and it certainly worked for us on a few occasions. So helpful hint in getting that kind of communication across. So we've got a big issue here. We're not the only sector. But then the Home Secretary Amber Rudd made an important announcement. So tell us about the Migrant Advisory Centre's call for evidence document, Sally, and what does it say?
Picked out a few of the main points, of which one of them is on the slide here. So concentrating on what constitutes a skills shortage. One of these points states it would be a level 6 qualification or above. The majority of EU immigrants working within the logistics sector are actually a level 2. To give you perhaps a little bit more of a perspective on the levels, a transport manager CPC exam is actually level 3. So even your transport managers wouldn't be covered by this part of.
So what we're saying here is that this committee that advises the Home Office on whether or not we've got a skills shortage is saying that we wouldn't even go off the first base here because we're not dealing with sufficiently highly qualified staff.
Within our sector, you are probably looking at director level by the time you've got to a level 6.
Yeah. Okay. So that's something we've got to change, and we need to get them to understand, using football stadium analogies or whatever it takes, that we actually have got a problem that they need to address here. But at least they're talking about this, aren't they?
Yeah. The middle section there, so it says obviously an identified shortage. We certainly don't have a problem with that because we definitely have an identified shortage.
Yes.
But the last point there, that it must be sensible to address this shortage using immigration from outside the EEA. Well, our difficulty with this is that obviously HGV licenses are recognised throughout the whole of the EU, so you wouldn't need to take another HGV licence. But obviously, if we were to recruit outside the EU, then that's a lot more complicated because the licences don't automatically over here. They wouldn't actually be legal to drive. So actually, looking outside of the EEA, it's not as sensible.
Yes. And we've got to make sure they understand that we only solve part of this problem by recruiting from within the EEA at the moment. So this is a call for evidence by the Migration Advisory Committee, to which we will obviously make a response informed by this, and that will be going in this autumn. There is a deadline quite soon, I believe.
It's actually October, so we should be able to do a good consultation with members on this.
Excellent, good. And just thinking ahead then, the point in the process where these sorts of skill shortages could possibly be particularly acutely felt might be around the seasonal peaks. And one of the features we need to get the government to understand is the seasonality of employment in the sector. So given that we're only 19 months away from leaving in March 2019, what do we think might happen in Christmas 2019? How is Christmas 2019 going to get delivered if we don't have access to it?
We're always worrying about Christmas, aren't we? So Christmas 2019, yes, it will all depend on what system government choose to implement post-Brexit.
Yeah.
All the government's options for a future immigration system have lots of pros and cons, certainly for our sector. So just run through a few of the systems that are in place in other countries and what the options are. So youth mobility scheme, which many other countries use for agricultural workers, but can also be used obviously for our sector as well. However, it means that you can only stay for 2 years. So this is actually quite limiting and doesn't encourage people to actually be part of a community. It's a short-term fix, and exactly what would happen if you actually wanted to retain certain employees. Would there be a process available for a more permanent stay? Numerical limits for this could be just a potential lobbying dogfight, as every sector is fighting over a number, a sort of share of that number that the government set. Then there's the question of how will it actually be split? Will the government favour EEA workers over those, or will they actually treat all new non-UK citizens the same? And obviously that would have its issues, as I explained earlier, with regards to HGV licences. Points-based systems, well, that could really work against our sector as it tends to favour high-skilled workers. And like I said earlier, the majority of logistics workers are at level 2. It's also quite a complicated system for employers. Labour market tests work well for full-time positions, but this wouldn't necessarily work so well for the seasonality and for agencies that use a lot of EU workers at the moment, and actually quite a number of self-employed EU workers as well within the logistics sector. The work permit approach has very many of the similar issues as the labour market tests, but they could also be quite costly for employers. So all of the options would need tweaking, as the current job stats for EU workers don't fit these options. There's also been a significant increase in low-skilled EU workers, and these are jobs that the government will need to ensure are covered just as much as encouraging high-skilled talent into London.
Right. So at least the right questions are being asked. We have the opportunity to make the case. I'm sure we won't be alone. There'll be many other sectors in a similar position. But this is, again, a welcome development, because at least the government is now publicly thinking about this issue, and in our views are at least asking the right questions, giving us the opportunity to start the conversation. So a massive amount of work to do.
Yeah. I will just clarify one thing, that obviously what our members now need to come and do to make sure that they can actually prepare for Christmas 2019. I got to Christmas eventually. My advice is that they really start to look to developing their homegrown talent now. We've got to be able to plug the gap. We've got 2 years to prepare for this, and an apprenticeship only takes a year. So start investing in apprenticeships now. And
start spending your apprenticeship levy if indeed you pay it, and because it's there to be used. And the LGV driver apprenticeship is up and running. It's available for drawdown.
It is, and that is available across all the devolved countries.
Right, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Sally. That's a good start. Okay, so that completes the presentation and discussion on the main points of the presentation this afternoon. We're open now to any questions, or indeed any of your own observations and comments. I hope you're familiar with the chat facility on the webinar platform. We do have one question already that's been posted by one of our delegates, Derek. Thank you for that. Derek is asking whether we have any suggestions for expediting inspections and certifications for agri-food products. Alex, I think this one might be coming your way. A very specialist area, but perhaps just talk about some of the general techniques that could be used, and then maybe see if they're applicable to to this particular sector.
Thank you, James. It is a good question. It really is a case study of some of the challenges here for trade facilitation. The rules around bringing goods, agricultural goods, into the EU are pretty complicated. There's a lot of things that you would have to do. For example, you have to give, if you're bringing it by air, at least 4 hours notice, 3 working days notice if you're bringing it by other means. You've got to upload a bunch of information to a special website, including certificates that the product is that meets phytosanitary requirements and transport information, and you know, theoretically, it also has to be presented for inspection. So I won't go onto that too much. The short answer is, if the UK and the EU were to apply to each other the same rules that it applies to currently to non-EU agricultural goods, we really have a problem here. Now, the question is, what do we do about it? What are our suggestions? I think there's a couple of things I would say about this. One is, look at break up imports and exports. Now, the UK could unilaterally take quite a relaxed view about agri-food products coming in from the EU. You know, it could do that. You know, it could simply say, you know, these goods, provided they conform to EU standards, the origin is the EU, we can essentially apply the same light touch regime that we do now. you know, the really tricky stuff, and this is coming up all the time, is what would the EU do for British agri-food products that they're bringing to their market? You know, so this is going to be, along with many other things, hotly debated in the negotiations, I suspect. The only other thing I would suggest there, James, is Derek, is we look at the idea of trusted traders, and if you can be, there is a scheme called the Plant Passport Scheme that if you're taking some controlled goods into the EU, you need to be registered for. I think it's to do with goods that could agri goods that could carry pests. So it's kind of showing that you've been inspected and that you're a trusted trader in that sense. And that concept is something that, you know, Chris talked about this earlier, the authorised economic operator concept. This whole concept could be absolutely vital to bringing goods through with the minimum of checks and barriers.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and also making that fit for purpose, because the authorised economic operator model is devised for a different purpose. It may not necessarily be necessary in all its glorious details for this particular sector, but as a principle, that could be the way forward. Chris, you have an observation.
Yeah, this is a very difficult area, I think, as the question, you know, sort of suggests.
Yeah.
So it will be a high priority for us going forward in looking at the kind of fast-track procedures linked to trusted trade area that Alex referred to.
Yeah.
But in the international area, this is becoming a very problematic area with the potential invasive species getting into packaging and in containers and that kind of thing. So the World Food Organization and other international agencies like the International Maritime Organization are currently looking at what steps both traders and the transport operators in the supply chain can take to improve security in this area. There's no immediate proposals, but we are working with the international transport providers to come up with some best practices in this area, which we will shortly publish. So we'll keep a note of Derek's question here to ensure that all in the supply chain take the necessary steps to minimise the risks here. But I think what it's focusing is that the food sector is likely to come under further pressures as a result of these wider problems in biodiversity and invasive species.
Okay. We don't have any other questions pending right at the moment, but again, can I extend an invitation to all those on the webinar to either follow up with us through the platform, which will still be live until the end of the session, or indeed through your normal communication channels into FTA. We realise there's a lot of information that we're offering you this afternoon. We hope you found it easily digestible, but as the thoughts occur or the questions are asked of you in your businesses, please do help involve us, let us help you advise your own businesses on the implications of Brexit as far as we know them. Because although the webinar is going to end in about 5 minutes or so, we're going to be here still for you as your trade association. So don't forget us in trying to answer some of these issues as they arise. I think we're approaching the end of the webinar now, so I am going to pull things together if there are no other questions. First of all, I'm going to reinforce the fact that we continue to monitor these developments. Most of what you've heard this afternoon is simply a snapshot in time. As we've explained, the customs proposals are still just that. They're the first stage of what will be a long negotiation. The repeal bill has yet to be discussed in anger in the House of Commons, and a lot could happen there. And of course, it's really early days in the prospect of developing new international trade deals. So a lot of the material that we've discussed will change, and possibly change quite rapidly over the coming days and weeks. So follow the story, follow the developments with FTA. We will continue to do these monthly webinars, and I'll give you the date of the next one in just a moment. which point we'll try to bring together all of the developments over the previous 4 or 5 weeks. We continue to publish updates as they occur and briefings through our weekly e-news. Consider the subjects in some more detail in Freight Logistics magazine. Hopefully you're following us on Twitter, and certainly alerts and updates to new developments will probably break there first, allowing you to jump into the FTA website and other sources for further information. As we've already said, the way to involve you and your business in shaping and influencing these debates is to join our freight councils, either at regional or indeed at national level, or the various working groups that FTA operates, in particular the Customs Working Group, which we have set up and revitalised necessarily in the light of Brexit developments, and more details on that are available from us. Alex Speech is the secretary of that group. And for those of you concerned about employment and skills development issues generally, can I recommend our Skills Working Group, which Sally looks after. There was a meeting of that in September, not just looking at some of these EU migration issues, but the whole gamut of apprenticeships and skills development policy in the UK. And we're really reviewing the first 3 or 4 months serious activity around the apprenticeship levy at the meeting that's taking place there in September. So do please let us know if employment law, HR and skills development issues are of interest to you, because again we have recently revitalised that group and we're anxious to broaden the member involvement there. Okay, so we've had a question come through as to when we will publish the slides that we've used today. We will put those available on the website, on the webinar website, I suspect tomorrow, and they'll be able to be downloaded as a file for your use locally. And the only health check I would put on that is just do remember they are likely to go out of date as developments continue. So if you are going to use them further in your business, please do just check them through, make sure that they are still relevant and up to date, and come back to us if you want to get the latest position. So can I first of all, on your behalf, thank all our presenters, to thank Christopher, thank Alex, thank Chris and Sally for their presentations this afternoon. Thanks very much, guys, well done. All good stuff there. Can I thank you, our delegates, for joining us, and I hope you found the presentations helpful and stimulating. Our next seminar, webinar, will be on Wednesday the 13th of September at 11 o'clock. Please do join us for that if you're able to, and register for that in the usual way. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thank you and goodbye.